I've played a number of side-scrolling action-adventure games on 8-bit consoles, but they're few and far between on the Sega Genesis. Actually, RPGs in general there are scarce, so you can imagine my delight when I discovered Cadash for the first time. It took me back to my NES adventures with that nameless warrior on his quest to save the world tree, so of course I was very curious to see how it would compare. Because of its roots in the arcades, I imagine that Cadash would lean a little more heavily into that style versus being a sprawling and developed RPG experience. While that's mostly true in terms of its gameplay, what did stand out to me was the fantastic backstory. It describes a war-ravaged land that's been torn apart by hatred and violence. The deity overseeing these peoples physically parted the world in two, banishing the demons to the lower dredges and providing a beautiful, light-filled world above to the humans. Over many years of cultivating his hatred for the people in the world of light, an underworld Balrog decided to reclaim those lands by kidnapping the princess of the human king and marrying her. Your journey begins in the king's throne room as he explains your duty to rescue his daughter and ensure the continuation of their realm's peace. After this interaction, unfortunately, the story dwindles down to a trickle. There are no cutscenes to speak of apart from a few dialogue exchanges after boss fights. While there are plenty of residents to strike up some conversation with in your travels, much of what they have to say doesn't really take the story any deeper. Some do point you in the right direction of the plot, but most of the things that come out of their mouths are elementary tidbits about using money to buy things or making sure to check out the shops that exist throughout the quest. It was one of the strangest tutorials that I've ever had. These precious dialogue boxes could have been filled with something of substance, but instead they insisted on stating the obvious over and over again. I'm really surprised that one of them didn't tell me to make sure to talk to people in the villages along the way. I think what bothered me the most was that the majority of these folks never change up their dialogue. In other games, whenever something gets resolved, you can revisit people, especially those central to the plot event taking place, and usually hear some updated lines. Here though, with very few exceptions, nothing ever evolved beyond that first exchange. People that were desperate for my help 30 minutes prior didn't even seem fazed when I'd returned to town after a victory, and this really affected my ability to get into the plot or really care about anything that I was doing. After a while, I gave up on backtracking to seek out characters that had nothing new or important to add, and actually, once I figured out who didn't move the plot along, I avoided them altogether. While I don't need a constantly transforming world to make me feel like my game is progressing, I do expect some adaptation to make it feel like it's a lived-in place that doesn't just exist for the sake of my quest. It's sad to say, but once you get a handle on the basics, you can confidently avoid speaking to 90% of NPCs and not lose anything in terms of cohesion. It's also really hard to lose your way in this adventure. Cadash is structured into stages where you'll typically have the refuge of a town on the edge of an underworld area that's packed with fiends. It's the furthest thing from an open world affair, since you're barred from moving forward until you finish up the tasks in the current leg, but you can move backwards as far as you like. As Saving Money's biggest fan, I appreciated this and often took breaks from the action to return to a cheaper inn or to restock items in previous villages. It was also nice that most new zones had a place to rest as well as a unique inventory stock to peruse. This could have been frustrating if the game was really long and you had to keep detailed notes on what was available in each of the towns, but thankfully there's only a handful to track. There was no mystery buying here either, since everything was fully described in the manual and in the shops while you were browsing. The only real limitations were the inventory size, since you can only hold up to 4 of most things, and the way that consumables work. I have a love-hate relationship with this aspect. Anything in your inventory that heals or cures you is automatically used up when it's needed, and you have absolutely no control over it. On one hand, this was great because when I died, I expected the medicinal herbs to kick in and wrench me back to the realm of the living. With something like the antidotes on the other hand, they were instantly deployed the moment you got poisoned. Poisoning here works like it does in most games, where you lose HP over time. So in situations where I was still at risk of being poisoned again and had plenty of health, I didn't necessarily want to be cured right away. There was one fight in particular where this really wore down my patience. I was trapped in a room with a boss that would repeatedly poison me. Because the space was so small and he was so hard to avoid, I'd usually finish the fight afflicted with no more antidotes left to my name, but plenty of health. Because poison doesn't wear off, I'd have to do the walk of shame all the way back to town, restock my supply, and come all the way back to fight the monster again, only to end up in the same predicament more often than not. After 3 or 4 times of this happening to me, I would have given anything for some autonomy over item use, if only for this one situation. The underworld combat sections of each stage were just right in terms of their size and scope. It felt risky traveling out into battle, but these places weren't so big that I felt lost or needed to map anything out. There were plenty of rewards for exploring, but unfortunately, most items that you'd find in chests were the same ones that you could buy at shops. In terms of armor and weapons, there were surprisingly none to be found in the wild, with all of them needing to be purchased. What you could wield or wear depends on which character class you chose at the beginning of the game, with fewer options available overall for the mage. Initially, I felt like I was gambling every time I bought something new, with no way to tell if it was better than what I already had on. While the manual has those nice item descriptions I mentioned, it completely lacks information on weapons and armor. None of the storefronts did anything to demystify things either. I eventually learned that equipment that you find later on in the game is always better than the stuff that you get earlier. It's always worth the money spent. My playthrough with the fighter was way more expensive just because of how many more cool things he could wear compared to the mage, but money was extremely easy to come by if you could find the richest monsters to rob. One of my favorite parts of this entire game was how the character sprites would change whenever you'd equip new gear. I wish more games from this era did this, and it almost made up for the sorely lacking story. Almost. On the topic of graphics, it's clear that the majority of the effort went into the character sprites as well as the monsters and townspeople. There's something about how the protagonists scooch up and down vines that made me laugh every single time I saw them do it, but in general, I liked the variety of character animations, especially for all of the different attack moves. The shops and houses also had plenty of finer details that really made them pop, but the underworld battle areas felt a bit boring comparatively. Lots of the scenery could be best described as repetitive. Some of the skies looked like those textures that you could apply to a slide in Microsoft PowerPoint, and I was a little bit torn on whether or not I liked the look of them. The music was generally very good, with the composers achieving an interesting fantasy vibe with some mystery mashed into many of the melodies. Nothing in particular stood out as unpleasant, and it was completely devoid of that popular flatulent bass sound that so many games on the console seemed to feature. Now, you may be wondering if there's any benefit to playing with one class over the other, and after completing the game with both, I'd say that the fighter is the easier of the two. This conclusion solely stems from his higher speed and attack power, making combat more manageable. The mage does have the advantage of spells that are learned as he levels up, but casting them was annoying in the heat of the moment. It really boils down to the frustrating control for the magic menu. To call it up, you have to hold the B button and then wait for each spell to scroll by until you get to the one that you want. Then you have to time your button release to use it. This doesn't sound difficult in principle, but in practice, the enemies don't stop and politely wait for you to make your selection. And if you get hit before you get your cast out, the menu gets cancelled and you have to start over again. You really have to get lucky to find a safe spot on screen and somehow avoid not only the enemies themselves, but anything they're throwing around too. Since I couldn't reliably depend on magic the majority of the time, I only used it in boss fights when I had one monster to focus on. It was still far from perfect even in those situations, but that's at least where I found it to be the most dependable. The rest of the time, whether I was playing as the fighter or the mage, I stuck to melee combat just for the convenience. Both characters have the same movesets, though the hit detection against enemies was questionable. I could sometimes see my sword pass straight through an enemy, and somehow I'd take damage instead. This was especially true of the downward kick, which really isn't a kick at all, but I digress. The enemies in Cadash could be best described as underwhelming. I loved their designs and all of the neat patterns that they threw at me to master, but none of them presented any real challenge. Almost all hand-to-hand fighting came down to timing, and everything could be overcome with a little brute force. It was very mindless compared to other games, and I personally enjoy a bit more strategy. In terms of some of my favorites here, I loved the pigmen in the first area, as well as these short-range fire-breathing dragons you run into later on. There were so many neat monsters here along with the usual generic ones, but nothing really put any fear into me other than the bosses, and even they weren't too hard after a few attempts. In the few circumstances where I was getting wrecked in battle, Cadash's generous experience system for leveling up, as well as the frequent equipment upgrading opportunities, always provided a way around the problem. Grinding was an absolute must, but I didn't find it to be a chore. I scouted out a couple of great spots with respawning enemies that yielded a lot of golden experience. Compared to other long grinding sessions I've endured in turn-based RPGs, this was a piece of cake. I mostly beat down on these big rock monsters who kept walking straight into my swinging sword or staff, and they gave something ridiculous like 70 experience points per kill. I also love that the Sega Genesis port dropped the timer mechanic from the arcade altogether, so you can take all the time you want bopping enemies to death and reaping the spoils of victory. The one big negative I have for Cadash is that the flow of the game, including every single dialogue exchange, plot point, and enemy spawn, are exactly the same regardless of which character you choose to play as. I was expecting something a little closer to Castlevania Bloodlines. In that one, you have two characters that not only control differently, but there are also little offshoots in the level layouts that can only be accessed by one of them. While these things don't make Bloodlines feel completely brand new with each character, it's enough to at least make their separate playthroughs feel fresh and distinct from one another. Cadash completely missed an opportunity here to do just that, and I think that it was really short-sighted to make all playable campaigns virtually identical. Making one character a magic user just wasn't enough to set them apart. I can't speak for what might be available in the omitted character classes here from other versions of the game, like the TurboGrafx or the arcade. But even if there is something different there, it does nothing to save the Genesis version's complete lack of replay value. In terms of its difficulty, Cadash feels top-heavy with much of the trouble bubbling up right at the game's opening. Until you get a couple of levels under your belt, it's very easy to get crushed by the first underworld area and the enemies within. They'll throw all sorts of things at you, including death water that saps your life away with some of the worst knockback I've ever experienced, as well as flying enemies that you can barely see before they hit you. Also, you don't have the benefit of being able to stock up on herbs at an apothecary or run back to the inn and rest when things get hairy here either. This was usually the part of the adventure where I'd burn through one of my precious few continues, but if things went really poorly, I didn't feel too dejected hitting reset and trying again. Because side-scrolling action-adventure games and RPGs are some of my very favorites to play, I was incredibly excited to try out Cadash when I first discovered it. While it does have a lot of really cool ideas packed into its short playtime, I don't feel like it really excels at any of them. That's not to say that it wasn't fun, but it didn't really hold my attention for very long since I finished it my first time playing in a couple of hours, with my second playthrough being even shorter. All Cadash really did for me was make me appreciate other RPGs that are well developed and rich in all of the things that I love about the genre. It was nice for a quick non-committal playthrough, and if you're looking for a brief romp through a fantasy world with some great music and nice scenery, Cadash will certainly keep you entertained for a couple of hours.